Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy deep time strange worlds and the hidden history of life, please remember to like this video, subscribe and share it with a friend who loves science. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for spending your time here today. I'm also curious, what time are you watching this and where in the world are you right now? Let me know in the comments. Around 470 million years ago, during the Ordovician period, the solid surfaces of the planet are mostly bare when viewed from above a patchwork of rock, sand and shallow pools that stretch away from the shorelines. The continents sit closer to the equator, oceans cover much of the globe, and waves break against empty coasts with almost no permanent green to soften their edges. Life is abundant in the seas, with algae, invertebrates and early fishes filling the water. But on land, the story is almost the opposite. The air is rich in carbon dioxide and poor in oxygen. The ultraviolet radiation is harsher at the surface, and the ground is dry and poor in nutrients, except where thin films of water collect after rain or tides. Yet in these narrow, transient wet zones, something new begins to take hold. Thin mats of simple plants spread across wet rock and mud clinging close to the surface. They are small, a few layers of cells thick without true roots, wood or leaves, and their lives are tightly tied to the presence of water. They resemble in many ways the mosses of the modern world, though they are not quite the same. They absorb water directly across their exposed surfaces, and when the water retreats or evaporates, they either remain in places that stay damp or endure drying and hope to recover when moisture returns. To exist at all in this environment, these early land plants must solve problems that their marine ancestors never faced. In water, buoyancy supports soft bodies, nutrients drift past in solution, and cells are not exposed to the same degree of drying or temperature swings. On land, every part of the plant is in direct contact with moving air, and that air can remove water quickly. Gravity pulls downward without the cushioning support of seawater, so any plant that rises even a short distance above the ground must bear its own weight. The soil where it exists is not a rich dark layer, but a thin veneer of weathered minerals and scattered organic particles. In many places, bare rock still dominates, only slowly breaking down under wind, water and changing temperatures. Early land plants occupy a narrow set of microhabitats, where conditions are just barely suitable. They cluster along the edges of freshwater pools on the surfaces of floodplains that are regularly inundated, and in low-lying depressions where groundwater seeps to the surface. They may coat the sides of streams and the upper reaches of tidal flats, forming dark, spongy films that can survive repeated wetting and drying. Observations of modern desiccation-tolerant mosses and liverworts offer clues suggesting that some of these pioneers likely allow their internal water content to fall dramatically when the environment dries, entering a kind of suspended state in which metabolism slows almost to a halt. When water returns, their cells rehydrate and biochemical processes resume. This strategy is demanding because repairing the damage caused by extreme drying consumes energy and requires robust molecular machinery. It limits growth and the ability to build complex structures, but it offers survival in an otherwise lethal setting. The alternative is to remain in places where moisture is almost always present, such as waterfall spray zones and permanent swamps, but in the Ordovician those refuges are patchy and narrow. The early plants are caught between these options, represented by fragile forms that hug water and resilient forms that withstand its loss. The air over these early coastal plains is thick with carbon dioxide, which is both a resource and a danger. Plants need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, the process that fuels their growth, but to absorb it they must open tiny pores in their surfaces, pores that also allow water to escape. In an atmosphere with high carbon dioxide, the balance is somewhat favourable, since plants can capture enough gas without opening these pores for long, reducing water loss. Even so, the combination of bright sunlight, exposed surfaces, and moving air means that drying remains a constant threat. Little by little, these simple plants begin to influence their surroundings. Their bodies trap fine particles of sediment, creating thin, dark patches that are slightly more stable than bare rock. When they die, their remains accumulate modestly, enriching the surface with organic matter. Each generation leaves behind traces that make it marginally easier for the next to establish. The effect is subtle, and from a distance the continents still look barren, but new feedbacks between living tissue and mineral surface have started to operate. Over long spans of time, the presence of even low, flimsy vegetation changes how water flows across the land. Plant mats slow the speed of overland runoff after rain, encouraging small amounts of water to soak into cracks and pores instead of racing immediately back to the sea. Retained moisture in turn promotes further growth of these same mats. Chemical interactions between plant tissues, microbial communities, and mineral grains begin to alter the rate at which rocks break down, setting the stage for the formation of true soils. In the Ordovician, these processes remain in their infancy, but they are measurable and directional. There is no forest yet, no canopy, and no deep canopy shade. Instead, life on land consists of low scattered patches that extend only a short distance from water, and they are vulnerable to disturbance. Floods can strip them away, drought can bleach them, and the shifting of sediment can bury them beyond recovery. The colonization of a land is not a single smooth wave, but a series of advances and setbacks, driven by climate tectonics and random events. Some shorelines lose their vegetation when conditions turn unfavorable, while others become new centers of expansion. From the perspective of geological time, these fluctuations average out, and the overall pattern is clear. What begins as a nearly invisible film becomes a more continuous cover in certain regions, and the narrow green ribbon along water margins slowly widens. Marine sediments from this interval, drilled and studied in modern times, preserve microscopic remains of spores that match the timing of this expansion. They record the presence of plants that are releasing their reproductive cells into air and water, relying on these fragile units to bridge the gaps between safe habitats. The spores are coated with resistant compounds that help them survive exposure and travel, a key adaptation for life that no longer depends entirely on continuous water. Each spore that lands in a promising place has the potential to start a new patch of vegetation, but most fail. The success of this strategy depends on overwhelming loss, offset by persistent occupation. It is a quiet, statistical conquest rather than a march. At this early stage, the planet does not yet carry the deep, extensive root systems that will later knit sediments together and carve permanent channels across continents. Rivers still shift freely, often braided and unstable, and wind can move loose grains with little resistance. Yet the Ordovician colonization of land plants marks the first step toward a very different Earth one, in which the interface between rock, air, and water is mediated by living tissue at almost every point. The scale of the change is not yet visible in the outline of the continents, but it is already present in their chemistry and in the fragile pioneering communities that sit at the edge of the tide. The future forests of the Devonian depend on these early experiments on every plant that manages to hold on to water long enough to grow to reproduce and to leave behind another small layer of organic matter. In the long view, the thin scattered mats of Ordovician vegetation are not an endpoint but an opening state, a first proof that life can extend its reach from sea to land, and in doing so begin to alter the entire surface of the planet. In a small valley in what is now upstate New York, long after the Devonian forests themselves have vanished, human quarry workers cut into layers of grey rock to make way for construction. They are interested in stone, not in prehistory, but as they remove blocks of sandstone and shale, they begin to notice strange shapes preserved in the rock. Cylindrical forms broken off at their bases rise from the quarry floor like the ghosts of tree trunks. Some are wide enough that a person could imagine standing within their ring, and they seem to emerge from an ancient soil surface that has turned to stone. Early in the 20th century, paleontologists arrive at this site near the town of Gilboa and realize that they are looking at the remains of a very old forest, a forest that flourished in the middle of the Devonian period when plants on land are already far more advanced than the low mats of the Ordovician shores. The vertical shapes appear to be stumps, and they are arranged in a pattern that suggests living trees once grew in place rooted in the sediment. Artists and scientists collaborate to reconstruct what this fossil forest might have looked like. They picture tall trunks rising high above the ground, branching into crowns of foliage that intercept the sunlight. In these reconstructions, the Gilboa trees are often portrayed as the first real forests, and their presence supports a simple story. In that story, plants evolve wood as a way to grow taller, to race upward toward the light, and to break through any canopy formed by competing species. Trunks are seen as the main event, the defining feature of a tree, and the existence of upright fossils seems to confirm that height is the central goal. For many decades, textbooks and museum displays echo this interpretation. The Gilboa forest becomes an icon, a snapshot of the moment when trees conquer the land and cast the first deep shade. The fact that the quarry exposes large upright casts reinforces this focus on what stands above ground. The roots that fed these structures, the underground architecture that held them in place, remain largely hidden within the rock, difficult to extract and easy to overlook. As analytical methods improve and new finds accumulate, paleobotanists revisit old assumptions. They re-examine fossil thin sections under microscopes, measure cell wall patterns, and compare the internal organization of these ancient plants with that of modern trees and ferns. In the early 21st century, a fresh excavation at Gilboa removes additional rock and exposes more of the fossil surface than has been seen before. This time, attention turns not only to the towering stumps, but also to the network of structures that spread out from them. Researchers map roots, trace their directions, and analyze the tissues preserved within them. What they find complicates the old picture. The large vertical forms once thought to be typical woody trunks do not contain true wood in the modern sense. Their tissues are complex and organized, but they lack the distinctive secondary xylem that characterizes most living trees. They represent a different solution to the problem of standing upright, one that relies on other types of supporting tissue. By contrast, the floor of the fossil forest is crowded with the remains of a different plant altogether, a plant that does not look like a tree when reconstructed above ground, but possesses roots built from genuine wood. These woody roots spread horizontally and vertically through the sediment, forming a dense mesh that stabilizes the substrate. In effect, the underground parts of this modest plant have evolved what the towering trunks above have not. If wood is key to conducting water efficiently and providing strong mechanical support, then in this ancient ecosystem, the most advanced woody structures live largely out of sight. This realization forces a shift in perspective. The long-standing idea that wood evolves primarily to lift leaves toward the sun now appears incomplete. Instead, it seems that wood can first appear in parts of the plant that never see the sky, serving to anchor the organism and move water within the soil. Height may still follow, but it follows as a secondary advantage built on foundations laid below ground. The Gilboa forest, once hailed as the archetype of early treescapes, turns out to be more like a laboratory of experimentation, where different lineages test different combinations of tissues, body plans and strategies. Some grow tall with unconventional supports, others remain comparatively low but invest heavily in woody roots. The quarry walls preserve the results as a cross-section through these experiments. To a modern observer, the revision of the Gilboa story is a reminder of how much scientific understanding depends on where attention is directed. When eyes and tools are aimed mainly at what rises above the surface, trunks and crowns appear to hold all the answers. When new work exposes roots and reveals their internal structure, a different story emerges, one in which the hidden half of the plant plays a decisive role in the conquest of land. The fossils have not changed, but the questions asked of them have. Radiometric dating and careful stratigraphic work place the age of this forest in the late Middle Devonian, long after the first colonization of land, but still early in the history of large plants. Comparable sites elsewhere in the world, though fragmentary, hint that Gilboa is not an isolated case. Other assemblages show combinations of non-woody trunks and woody subterranean parts, reinforcing the idea that the sequence of innovations in plant evolution does not always match the simple ladder drawn in diagrams. Wood does not arrive fully formed in a classic tree. It arises in steps in specific tissues with specific functions, which are then repurposed and extended. The Gilboa discoveries, old and new, act as a bridge between the modest pioneers of the Ordovician and the towering trees that appear later in the Devonian. They show that by the time true forests spread widely, the groundwork has already been laid by organisms that invest in robust root systems and complex vascular arrangements. They also underscore how much remains to be learned from fossil sites that have been known for more than a century. In the quiet layers of a single quarry, the story of how plants conquer the land becomes less about a sudden leap into the canopy and more about a gradual reorganization of tissues starting in the dark, moist spaces where roots meet rock. In the early Devonian period, long after the first fragile mats have taken hold on Ordovician shores, but before towering forests are common, the problem that dominates plant life on land is simple to state and difficult to solve. Water is abundant in the oceans and in rivers, lakes and swamps, but it is scarce and unreliable in the thin layer of air and soil that plants must cross if they are to rise above mere films on wet stones. The atmosphere now holds less carbon dioxide than it did in the Ordovician, a change driven in part by the very presence of photosynthetic life-drawing carbon from the air and burying it in sediments. For plants, this shift has a double effect. On one hand, lower carbon dioxide makes photosynthesis less efficient, unless the plant opens the tiny pores in its outer surfaces, the stomata, for longer periods. On the other hand, every moment that a stoma remains open allows water to escape as vapor. The act of breathing in carbon dioxide through stomata is inseparable from the loss of water from the internal tissues to the dry air outside. In a world where the air is moving, where sunlight warms surfaces and encourages evaporation, this exchange is not balanced in the plant's favor. Small early Devonian plants that sit close to the ground and lack complex internal plumbing can only respond in a limited set of ways. Some cling to environments that remain wet almost all the time, such as the edges of streams, peat-filled hollows and sites where groundwater emerges. These plants rely on constant external moisture, and their bodies are not well protected against drying. Others adopt a more extreme strategy that resembles the desiccation tolerance seen in modern so-called resurrection plants. They allow their tissues to lose most of their water content during dry spells, entering a reversible state of physiological suspension. When rain returns or when floodwaters rise, they take up water and restart metabolism. Both strategies come with costs. The first ties the plant to particular habitats and limits how far it can spread inland or uphill. The second demands robust molecular systems for repair and recovery, and restricts how large and complex the plant can become, because the entire body must be able to endure repeated cycles of drying and rehydration. As more lineages move onto land, the limitations of these approaches become increasingly apparent. The Devonian continents include broad upland surfaces, seasonal climates, and regions where water arrives in pulses rather than as a constant flood. Wind sweeps across these landscapes, enhancing evaporation. Soils are still thin and patchy, but they are developing more structure than in the Ordovician, as roots and microbial films work on the underlying rock. Nutrients are often locked in minerals that water must penetrate and dissolve before plants can access them. To survive and expand under these conditions, plants need to do more than sit and wait for the environment to provide. They must begin to control the movement of water within their own bodies. A plant that lifts part of itself above the ground, even by a modest amount, encounters both challenges and opportunities. The challenges come from increased exposure to drying winds and stronger sunlight, which can accelerate water loss. The opportunities come from improved access to light and carbon dioxide, especially if nearby plants also begin to grow taller and cast shade. The central engineering problem is therefore how to draw water from contact with moist soil and deliver it upward through tissues to elevated surfaces, while also preventing catastrophic loss through open stomata. In simple non-vascular plants, water moves mainly by diffusion and capillary action through thin tissues. These processes are effective over very short distances, but quickly become inadequate as size increases. There is no dedicated internal pipeline, no specialized network of tubes. As evolution continues through the early Devonian, some lineages start to develop conducting tissues that can move water more efficiently from one part of the body to another. These tissues form strands that run vertically within stems and horizontally within creeping axes, offering a path of lower resistance for water flow. Yet the development of such pathways introduces further constraints. Conducting cells must be strong enough to resist collapse under the tension created when water is pulled upward, and they must remain open and unobstructed to maintain flow. This demands changes in cell walls, including the deposition of materials that stiffen and reinforce the structure. At the same time, plants face another physical limit. The external environment does not simply supply water, it also imposes periodic droughts. Rainfall patterns, the depth of the water table, and the frequency of flooding all vary from place to place and from time to time. A plant that relies solely on shallow surface moisture may flourish briefly during a wet season and then die when the ground dries. To reduce this vulnerability, some plants begin to extend parts of themselves into the substrate, probing cracks and pores in search of more stable water sources. These early rooting structures are not yet the fully developed roots of later trees, but they represent a clear step away from the ancestral state. They serve both to anchor the plant against mechanical disturbance and to increase the volume of soil from which water and dissolved nutrients can be drawn. With deeper contact comes a new kind of gradient. Water potential differs between various points in the soil and within the plant, and the organism can in principle shape these gradients through its own physiology. The balance between water uptake below and water loss above becomes a central factor in survival and success. The falling carbon dioxide levels of the Devonian sharpen this balance further. With less carbon dioxide available in the air, plants must open their stomata wider, or for longer periods to gather enough for photosynthesis. This pushes them toward higher water loss, unless they can compensate by pulling water more effectively from the ground. Environmental reconstructions suggest that as the period progresses, parts of the continents experience increasing seasonality with wet and dry phases that challenge shallow-rooted species. Under these conditions, small plants that invest in better internal water transport and slightly deeper anchoring may gain a modest but decisive advantage. They can hold their stomata open a bit longer without immediately wilting sustained photosynthesis for more of the day, and continue growing during periods when others must close down. They can also begin to explore microhabitats that are not constantly wet, extending the reach of vegetation beyond the narrow bands of swamps and pools that dominate earlier stages. From a distance in time, the Devonian problem of water on land looks like a widespread evolutionary pressure that shapes the direction of plant innovation. It is not a single event but a continuous set of constraints that act on many lineages simultaneously. Some respond by refining desiccation tolerance, others by improving contact with wet soil, and others by reorganizing their internal tissues to move water more efficiently. The fossil record captures snapshots of this process, rather than a complete sequence, but those snapshots are enough to show a trend. Plants are experimenting with ways to decouple themselves at least partially from the immediate moisture conditions at the surface. They are laying the groundwork for bodies in which leaves can sit high above the ground, while roots tap into water far below. Viewed in this way, the later appearance of true wood and complex vascular systems is not an abrupt innovation aimed solely at reaching sunlight. It is the culmination of many small changes, all driven by the same underlying requirement to keep tissues hydrated in a drying world. Before a forest can rise, before trunks can dominate the horizon, plants must learn to manage water on scales larger than a thin film on a rock. The early Devonian landscape, with its mixture of small struggling plants and improving but still primitive soils, is the arena in which this lesson is learned. As the Devonian period progresses, the need to move water efficiently from ground to air pushes certain plant lineages toward a new kind of internal architecture. In these plants, the conducting strands that first appear as simple channels begin to specialize. Some cells along these pathways lose their internal contents as they mature, becoming hollow tubes whose main purpose is to allow water to pass. Their walls thicken and develop reinforcing patterns that prevent collapse under the tension of rising water. These reinforced water-conducting cells form what botanists later call xylem, and they represent a decisive change in how plants manage their inner environment. In the most basic vascular plants, xylem appears as a single ring or small cluster near the center of the stem, surrounded by supporting and photosynthetic tissues. This primary xylem is enough to move water over short distances and to stiffen the stem slightly. It allows the plant to grow a little taller than its non-vascular relatives and to maintain a more consistent water supply to its upper surfaces. For a time, this arrangement is sufficient, and many early Devonian plants follow this template. However, in some lineages, additional layers of conducting and supporting tissue begin to form to the inside of the original xylem ring. These new layers are produced by a band of dividing cells that persist between the inner and outer tissues, adding rings of reinforced tubes year after year. The result is secondary xylem, which is functionally wood. Wood is not a single substance, but a composite of cellulose fibers embedded in a matrix of lignin, an organic polymer that resists decay and gives rigidity to cell walls. In these small Devonian plants, wood does not yet build massive trunks. Instead, it thickens stems and axes that rise only a short distance above the ground, sometimes no higher than a person's ankle, when scaled to modern human height. The presence of wood in such low plants at first seems counterintuitive. From a modern perspective, wood is associated with height, with trees that tower over the forest floor. It is easy to assume that the primary reason for evolving wood is to reach the light above competing vegetation. Yet the fossil record indicates that secondary xylem appears in some plants long before they achieve great size. Thin sections of Devonian fossils prepared and examined under the microscope show concentric bands of lignified cells in stems that would have supported only modest aerial structures. There are no wide tree rings or massive cross-sections, just repeated additions of conducting tissue that increase the thickness and density of the stem. This pattern suggests that the initial advantage of wood lies not in lifting leaves high into the air, but in moving water more effectively and safely within the plant body. Each additional layer of xylem provides more parallel pathways for water to flow from the base to the top. This redundancy reduces the impact of localized blockages such as those caused by air bubbles that form when water columns are under tension. It also allows the plant to adjust its water transport capacity as it grows, matching supply to demand. In an environment where the air is drying, carbon dioxide levels are dropping, and plants must open their stomata for longer periods to maintain photosynthesis. This ability to sustain a high rate of water movement becomes critical. The toughness imparted by lignin also means that stems and roots built with wood can resist mechanical stresses more effectively. When wind moves across the Devonian landscape, or when floodwaters surge over floodplains, plants with woody tissues are less likely to bend or break. Even at small sizes, this mechanical stability can mean the difference between survival and uprooting. It allows plants to occupy slightly more exposed positions rather than being confined to the most sheltered hollows. This in turn opens access to new light conditions and soil patches, allowing woody species to spread in patterns that pure anatomy alone would not reveal. The evolution of wood in these early plants does not occur in a single lineage or in a single place. Fossils from different Devonian deposits separated in space and time show evidence of secondary xylem in stems and roots belonging to distinct groups. This pattern indicates that wood arises independently more than once under similar selective pressures. In each case, the combination of internal water stress and external mechanical stress favors tissues that can both conduct and support. Viewed in this way, wood is not a unique invention of a single ancestral tree, but a recurring solution to a common set of problems faced by plants trying to expand their presence on land. Among the plants that show early wood, some remain small and never develop the classic tree form with a tall central trunk and a branching crown. Others eventually give rise to larger, more complex bodies. In one particularly informative species discovered in early 21st century work, secondary xylem is present in stems dating to the early Devonian, earlier than the woody roots mapped at Gilboa. These stems are associated with plants that stand only slightly above the ground, yet they already invest energy in building lignified tissues. The timing is important. It shows that wood exists before the appearance of the towering late Devonian forests, and that it begins to shape plant evolution while plants are still relatively low and scattered. Energy investment is a crucial point in this story. Producing lignin and organizing cellulose into strong-oriented fibers is metabolically expensive. Plants that allocate resources to wood must gain something significant in return. In the context of the Devonian climate, that something is improved control over water transport. With multiple layers of xylem, a plant can maintain a steeper gradient between its roots and its leaves, pulling water upward more effectively and keeping tissues hydrated despite prolonged stomatal opening. It can delay the onset of wilting and keep its photosynthetic machinery active during periods when non-woody neighbors are forced into inactivity. This advantage does not immediately translate into great height, but it creates the physiological conditions under which height becomes possible. Another consequence of wood is persistence. Woody stems and roots decay more slowly than softer tissues when the plant dies. They leave more durable impressions in the sediment and contribute more recalcitrant material to the developing soil. Over repeated generations, this steady input of lignin-rich debris helps build the organic component of soil, often called humus. Humus retains water and nutrients more effectively than mineral grains alone, creating a more favorable environment for subsequent plant growth. In this indirect way, the decision of certain Devonian plants to invest in wood feeds back into the broader environment, not only by influencing how much water they can move within their own bodies, but also by changing how water and nutrients behave in the ground they inhabit. The idea that wood first evolves as a mechanism for water management rather than as a simple bid for height changes how the history of forests is understood. It suggests that the conquest of land by plants proceeds from the inside outward. Before trunks reach upward, cell walls change. Before canopies spread, microscopic arrangements of lignin and cellulose define new ways for water to flow. The visible transformation of the Devonian landscape from patchy vegetation to structured forests rests on these invisible adjustments in plant plumbing. When later lineages seize the opportunity to grow tall, they do so using a toolkit assembled by smaller ancestors that never cast a deep shade. The first wood-filled stems rising only a short distance above the soil mark a quiet turning point. They show that plants are no longer just enduring the challenge of life on land. They're beginning to control that challenge from within, adapting their internal structures to make the most of a demanding world. In the layers of rock that preserve their remains, the cross-sections of these stems look simple compared to modern tree trunks, yet the principles they embody are the same. They are the first durable channels through which water flows in quantity, from the dark spaces below ground to the light-exposed tissues above a continuous column that links soil and air through living matter. In Middle and Late Devonian landscapes, the most transformative parts of many plants do not rise toward the sky at all, but extend downward and outward into the substrate. As stems and simple trunks thicken with wood, their underground counterparts begin to reorganize, branching repeatedly and testing the resistance of the surrounding sediment. What start as short anchoring strands in early land plants lengthen and subdivide, becoming systems that explore the soil in 3 dimensions. Each new branch increases the surface area in contact with the ground, and with it the opportunities for water and nutrient uptake. In cross-section, these roots show the same kind of reinforced conducting tissue that appears in stems with bands of lignified cells, forming continuous pathways from the outermost tips to the base of the plant. Water drawn from tiny pores in the soil enters this network and is pulled upward into the aerial parts, while dissolved minerals travel along with it. The combined effect is that plants can tap a larger volume of substrate and maintain their internal water status more effectively even when surface conditions fluctuate. In many Devonian fossils, the density and reach of the root systems exceed what would be expected from the modest height of the visible stems. Thin woody axes radiate in all directions from a central stump, sometimes penetrating several layers of sediment before they disappear from view. At sites like the ancient surface preserved near Gilboa, overlapping root traces cross and recross the fossil ground, forming a mesh that binds the sediment together. This subterranean mesh changes how the land behaves under the influence of water. When rain falls or rivers rise, soils reinforced by roots resist erosion more strongly than bare sediment. Water does not simply strip away the upper layer and carry it downstream. Instead, it must work around a lattice of living and dead tissues which slows the rate of removal. In low-lying areas, this stabilization allows fine particles to accumulate over time, building thicker soils than would be possible on an unrooted substrate. On slopes, it reduces the frequency of shallow landslides and shifts the balance from sudden mass movements to slower, more continuous creep. The same root systems that stabilize sediment also accelerate the breakdown of the mineral component of the crust. Root tips release carbon-rich compounds into the surrounding zone, altering the chemistry of the pore water. In the presence of these compounds and the carbon dioxide produced by plant respiration and microbial activity, slightly acidic solutions form around the root surfaces. These solutions react with minerals in the rock fragments and grains, leaching out elements like calcium, magnesium, and potassium. Some of these ions are absorbed by the plant and incorporated into its tissues. Others are washed away, eventually reaching streams and oceans. Over geological timescales, this biologically enhanced weathering plays a measurable role in reshaping the composition of the crust and in regulating atmospheric carbon dioxide. Each individual root affects only a narrow cylinder of sediment, but the cumulative effect of many plants covering large areas is significant. The three-dimensional spread of roots also creates an intricate pattern of small habitats in the sediment. Pores between grains, once relatively empty, become lined with organic films and filled with microbial communities that take advantage of the oxygen and carbon compounds leaking from the plant. Tiny invertebrates, some of them related to early arthropods, move through these spaces, feeding on detritus and on each other. Fungal filaments extend from roots into the surrounding soil, forming intimate partnerships with plants in which nutrients are traded for carbon. These symbiotic associations, which are common in modern forests, likely have their origins in these early rooted ecosystems, even if direct fossil evidence is sparse. The result is that the substrate beneath Devonian vegetation is no longer a simple layer of weathered rock. It becomes a structured medium partitioned by living tissues and their decay products into zones with different chemistry, porosity, and biological activity. Roots do not grow at random. Their branching patterns respond to gradients in moisture and nutrients proliferating where conditions are favorable and retreating or dying back where they are not. In a sense, each plant samples the soil volume around it, concentrating its efforts in patches that yield the best return. Over generations, these patterns leave a signature in the fossil soils or paleosols that geologists can read. Horizons enriched in organic matter, bands of carbonate accumulation, and variations in grain size all record the interaction between root systems and the physical environment. By comparing these features across different Devonian localities, researchers infer how extensive and effective early roots have become, and how they vary between plant communities. One important consequence of deep interconnected roots is their influence on groundwater. In earlier unrooted landscapes, most water infiltration is shallow. Rainwater runs off quickly or percolates only a short distance before returning to surface channels. With the advent of complex root systems, water can be drawn deeper into the ground, following the paths opened by the roots themselves. This deep infiltration recharges subsurface reservoirs and can sustain stream flow during dry periods, smoothing out extremes in the hydrological cycle. At the same time, transpiration from leaves and stems returns a portion of this water to the atmosphere, making plants an active component of the planetary plumbing. The balance between infiltration, storage, and transpiration becomes more complex and more interdependent as rooted vegetation spreads. In river valleys, these changes contribute to a transition in channel forms. Basins that once hosted wide, braided rivers with shifting, unstable bars increasingly show evidence of single, more sinuous channels bounded by vegetated banks. The roots that grip the banks and floodplains resist lateral erosion, allowing bends to persist and migrate slowly, rather than collapsing wholesale. Floodwaters overtop these rooted banks less frequently, but deposit their suspended sediment on stable floodplain surfaces when they do, building layered archives of soil and plant remains. Over time, the presence of roots encourages the development of meandering river systems with distinct point bars, levees, and backswamp environments. In this way, plant anatomy and river morphology become linked. The same woody tissues that conduct water within plants help determine how water carves its way across continents. Not all Devonian plants achieve the same degree of rooting. Some still rely on relatively shallow spreading structures, while others develop more vertically oriented systems that reach down toward the water table. The diversity of root architectures reflects the diversity of habitats and evolutionary histories. Certain lineages, for example, produce repeated tiers of lateral roots from a main axis, creating a framework that can penetrate deeply but still hold the upper soil in a tight grip. Others favor a dense network of fine roots near the surface, effective at capturing transient rainfall, but less able to withstand prolonged drought. The fossil record, though incomplete, shows that woody roots appear in multiple groups, mirroring the independent origins of wood in stems. This convergence underscores how powerful the selective pressures are. Wherever plants push into drier, more variable environments, root systems that can explore greater volumes and access more reliable water sources are favored. What emerges from this stage of plant evolution is an earth whose uppermost layer is no longer passive. Sediment and rock respond to climate and tectonics as they always have, but now they also respond to the growth, death, and decay of root networks. The line between geology and biology blurs at the scale of the soil profile. In the quiet spaces between grains, in the shaded zones beneath early forests and thickets, roots and their associated organisms are continuously adjusting the structure of the ground. They create pathways where none existed, seal others with organic coatings, and modulate how easily water and air move through the matrix. These changes, though invisible from above in any single moment, gradually accumulate. They make certain regions more hospitable to later waves of plants and animals, while depriving others of the same opportunities by redirecting water and sediment. In this sense, roots are not only responding to their environment, but also determining what that environment will be for future life. The conquest of land by plants therefore involves a hidden dimension, as important as the visible spread of leaves and stems. It is written not only in the silhouettes that catch the light, but also in the branching woody frameworks that penetrate the ground, turning the upper crust into a dynamic medium shaped from within. In the early stages of plant life on land, reproduction is tied as closely to water as everyday metabolic function. Many of the first colonizers rely on spores, tiny packages of genetic material, and minimal resources that must be released into the environment and somehow reach a suitable place to grow. These spores are produced in large numbers because each individual unit faces long odds. It may dry out, be buried too deeply, or land where there is not enough light or moisture to support development. For plants whose bodies remain low to the ground and close to standing water, the system works after a fashion. Spores settle nearby, and when conditions are favorable, they germinate into new individuals that continue the lineage. However, spores alone do not solve a more subtle problem that lurks inside the life cycle. In many of these early land plants, reproduction involves mobile reproductive cells that must swim through a thin film of water to meet and fuse. Without that film coating the surface of the plant or pooling in small depressions, fusion cannot take place. This requirement means that even plants which have successfully extended parts of their lives onto dry land remain dependent on brief intervals when water coats their tissues. The timing of reproduction must coincide with rain floods or persistent humidity. In a Devonian climate that is becoming more seasonal and more variable from region to region, this constraint limits where and when plants can truly thrive. As vascular tissues and wood improve internal water management, some lineages gain greater freedom from immediate surface moisture. They can keep their stems and primitive leaves hydrated, even when the air is dry for extended periods. This decoupling of internal and external water status opens a new evolutionary space. Once a plant can maintain its own hydration, it is no longer forced to occupy only those microhabitats that provide constant films of water for reproduction. Yet the reproductive cells themselves in traditional spore-based systems still depend on that external water to move. The next set of innovations in plant evolution therefore centers on changing how those cells are packaged, protected and delivered. In the fossil record, this shift appears in the form of spores that are not all the same size. Some Devonian plants produce many small spores that function as male units, and fewer larger spores that function as female units. The larger spores contain more stored food enough to support the early development of the embryo once fusion has occurred. This pattern, known in modern terminology as heterospory, contrasts with earlier systems in which all spores are roughly equal. In heterosporous plants, the larger female spores can be seen as an early step towards seeds, though they are not yet enclosed in the protective coats and complex structures that characterize true seeds in later periods. The presence of stored nourishment in the female spore gives the developing plant a head start, allowing it to grow for a time, even if external conditions are less than ideal. This subtle shift has far-reaching consequences. A spore that carries its own energy reserve can in principle disperse farther from the parent plant and still establish successfully. It can wait longer before germinating, surviving until conditions improve. It can also support a more substantial early growth phase, which may help the young plant extend its first roots and shoots into the surrounding environment. All of this reduces the strict dependence on a particular moment of surface wetness. The male spores, being smaller and more numerous, can be released in large quantities and rely on chance and air currents to reach regions near the female spores. The precise details of how these interactions happen are still under study and vary between lineages, but the overall direction is clear. Reproduction is becoming more insulated from the immediate condition of the soil surface and the fleeting presence of a water film. At the same time, the growing complexity of reproductive structures introduces new opportunities for variation. The tissues that produce spores can be arranged in different ways, borne on different parts of the plant, and accompanied by protective enclosures that shield developing spore bodies from drying or mechanical damage. Some Devonian fossils show evidence of sporangia, the organs that produce spores grouped in clusters or attached to specialized leaves. Others suggest the presence of early protective layers around developing reproductive units. Although preservation is often incomplete, the diversity of form indicates that plants are experimenting actively with how to manage the vulnerable stages of their life cycles. A particularly telling example of this experimentation comes from plants like Archaeopteris, which appear in the late Devonian. Archaeopteris has a woody trunk and branches with foliage that resembles that of modern ferns, and it reproduces using spores rather than fully developed seeds. Yet its reproductive system departs from the simple equal spore model. It produces distinct male and female spores, with the female spores larger and richer in stored resources. In this way, Archaeopteris occupies an intermediate position between spore-bearing ferns and seed-bearing trees. It shows that complex woody plants do not need to wait for the evolution of seeds to attain size and ecological importance, but it also hints at how the seed habit might arise from incremental changes within a spore-based framework. The link between wood and reproductive innovation is not accidental. The same vascular systems that allow a plant like Archaeopteris to grow tall and to move water efficiently through its body also support the production and maturation of more elaborate reproductive structures. A tall, well-hydrated plant can allocate resources to fewer better provisioned spores without jeopardizing its survival. It can afford to build tissues that protect and support these spores because its internal water supply and mechanical stability are secure. In turn, more reliable reproduction allows such plants to colonize and dominate wider areas, reinforcing their impact on the environment. There is an interplay between anatomy and life cycle that shapes the trajectory of plant evolution through the Devonian. From a modern perspective, seeds seem like an obvious destination. They offer protection, dormancy, and targeted resource allocation, all of which are advantageous on land. But the Devonian record reminds us that the path to seeds is gradual and contingent. Many lineages explore the space of reproductive possibilities without ever reaching the fully seed-bearing condition. Some develop features that resemble parts of a seed habit, such as size differences between spores or partial protective coverings, but then disappear from the record in later periods. Others remain faithful to equal-size spores and yet persist in specific niches where frequent moisture remains available. The fact that heterospory evolves independently in several groups suggests that the pressures leading towards seed-like strategies are widespread. Wherever plants push into environments with less predictable surface water, the ability to safeguard and support the earlier stages of the next generation becomes critical. The story is not only one of adaptation, but also of filtering. Worlds in which plants cannot protect their reproductive stages from intermittent dryness are worlds in which vegetation remains confined to narrow refuges. Worlds in which some plants find ways to buffer those stages against environmental variation can develop broad, continuous plant cover. In the Devonian, the appearance of heterosporous wood-bearing plants marks a turning point of this kind. They do not yet carry seeds, but they demonstrate that life cycles themselves can be reshaped to fit a world where land is becoming more complex, more structured, and more demanding. These changes extend the influence of plants beyond the span of a single growing season. By storing food in female spores, and by building tissues that shield reproductive phases from the immediate environment, Devonian plants begin to project their presence forward in time, into intervals when conditions might otherwise erase them. In doing so, they contribute to the long, slow shift from shore-bound mats to resilient three-dimensional forests that persist year after year across the continents. In the late Devonian period, the scattered stands of woody plants that have been slowly expanding across the continents are joined by a form that brings many of the earlier experiments together in a single body plan. This plant is known to modern science as Archaeopteris. It grows with a central woody trunk, branches that radiate outward, and foliage that resembles the divided fronds of a fern. In overall shape, it looks recognizably tree-like, yet its reproductive biology still belongs to an earlier stage of plant evolution, based on spores rather than fully enclosed seeds. Archaeopteris appears around the time when vascular systems, wood, and increasingly complex root networks have already altered large areas of land. Its trunk is built from true secondary xylem, making it a genuine woody plant by modern definition. When preserved in cross-section, its stems show rings and bands of lignified cells that record periods of growth. Its branches bear flattened sprays of leaf like organs that capture light, and exchange gases with the air powered by the same hydraulic system that lifts water from deep roots to high foliage. Unlike the smaller early wood-bearers of the Devonian Archaeopteryx reaches impressive heights, rising to tens of meters in favorable conditions. This vertical expansion creates a tiered environment beneath its crown, with light levels decreasing from the top of the canopy to the shaded forest floor. For the first time on Earth, large areas of land support true forests in the modern sense, with multiple layers of vegetation structured by access to light and space. Archaeopteryx does not evolve in isolation. It is part of a broader assemblage of plants that include simpler shrubs, fern-like forms, and various understory species. What sets it apart is the combination of tall woody stems, extensive roots, and a reproductive system that is more advanced than that of many earlier vascular plants, but still short of the seed condition. Its spores are of two types: small male units and larger female units stocked with stored food. The female spores function as early analogues of seed contents nourishing the developing embryo after fertilization. This heterosporous system allows Archaeopteryx to achieve a degree of reproductive independence from constant surface moisture, while still relying on the basic framework of spore production and release. Fossil remains of Archaeopteryx, including trunks, branches, roots, and reproductive structures, have been found on multiple present-day continents. During the Devonian, these landmasses are arranged differently from their modern positions, but the distribution of fossils shows that Archaeopteryx can thrive in a range of climatic zones. It anchors on floodplains, upland slopes, and coastal lowlands, wherever conditions permit the establishment of deep roots and the accumulation of sufficient soil. Its presence across such diverse settings indicates a robust and adaptable physiology, capable of dealing with variations in temperature, rainfall, and day length. In the ecosystems it occupies, Archaeopteryx acts as an organizer of space. Its trunk and main branches form a scaffold that supports the canopy. Its smaller twigs and leaves intercept sunlight, casting a pattern of light and shadow on the ground. This gradient in light availability allows shade-tolerant plants to specialize in the understory, while more light-demanding species occupy gaps and edges. The tree's root system penetrates deeply and spreads widely as with other woody Devonian plants, but on a larger scale. It stabilizes thick layers of sediment, influences groundwater flow, and enhances chemical weathering wherever forests of Archaeopteryx take hold. The combined effect is a restructuring of land surfaces at regional scales, not just in small patches. Animals respond to these new conditions. Early arthropods, including primitive insects and their relatives, move through the litter that accumulates beneath the trees, feeding on decaying plant material, fungi, and each other. Some climb onto trunks and branches, taking advantage of the vertical dimension that forests provide. Early vertebrates that occupy nearby streams and rivers encounter shaded channels lined with roots, fallen branches, and organic debris. These physical structures modify water flow, create pools and refuges, and contribute to a more varied aquatic habitat. Although Archaeopteryx itself does not create these animal groups, its architecture offers new niches for them to occupy. The relationship between Archaeopteryx and the atmosphere is likewise significant. Like all photosynthetic plants, each tree draws carbon dioxide from the air through its leaves and uses it to build organic molecules. In a forest dominated by Archaeopteryx, the total leaf area is vast. Over growing seasons, these trees withdraw substantial amounts of carbon dioxide, incorporating it into wood roots and leaves. When parts of the tree die, the more labile tissues decompose and return some carbon to the air, but the woody elements resist decay and are more likely to be buried in soils and sediments. At the same time, the deep roots of Archaeopteryx and similar trees enhance weathering of silicate rocks, which draws additional carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere over geological timescales. The result is a further decline in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels from the already reduced values of the early Devonian. This drawdown contributes to broad climatic changes, including cooling trends that affect ocean chemistry and life. In this sense, Archaeopteris is more than a passive inhabitant of its environment. It participates actively in altering the climatic and chemical context in which all Devonian organisms exist. The prominence of Archaeopteris also makes visible another feature of plant evolution. It demonstrates that a spore-bearing plant can achieve a fully tree-like habit and dominate landscapes without yet possessing seeds. For a long time, it is tempting to imagine that seed formation must precede the rise of large trees, since seeds offer clear advantages for reproduction on land. Archaeopteris shows that this is not strictly necessary. The combination of heterospory-efficient vascular systems and robust wood is enough to support tall, long-lived individuals and extensive forests. Seeds, when they evolve later in other lineages, will build on this foundation rather than define it from the outset. In the structure of Archaeopteris, paleobotanists see a bridge between ancient fern-like plants and the later gymnosperms, the seed-bearing trees that include conifers and their relatives. Its leaves resemble fern fronds, yet its trunk and roots reflect the organization of modern woody trees. Its reproductive strategy embodies a transitional step between simple spores and complex seeds. It is as if the plant occupies an intermediate position in a long series of changes, not as a missing link in a linear chain, but as one successful solution among several to the challenges of living tall on land. The dominance of Archaeopteris in many late Devonian forests does not mean that other forms disappear. Smaller, more primitive plants persist in understory niches and in habitats that are unsuitable for large trees. In places where soils are thin, where flooding is extreme, or where climate is too harsh, low vegetation still holds its ground. Yet the presence of Archaeopteris changes the overall character of the terrestrial biosphere. Large tracts of land now support continuous canopy, cover with feedbacks on regional climate hydrology and nutrient cycles. The land surface becomes a mosaic of shaded forests, open areas, and transitional zones, shaped in part by the distribution of these trees. From a scientific perspective, the fossils of Archaeopteris provide a concrete reference point for understanding how traits that first arise in small plants play out when combined in a larger, more integrated body. The same secondary xylem that appears in ankle-high plants of the early Devonian now builds trunks that rival modern trees in height. The root systems that once bound thin sediment layers on small floodplains now anchor deep soils over broad regions. The heterosporous reproduction that once gave a modest advantage in marginal habitats now supports the life cycle of a dominant forest former. Archaeopteris embodies the scaling up of earlier innovations into a form that unmistakably transforms the landscape. In the late Devonian, these trees stand as proof that plants have not only solved the problem of life on land, but have begun to reshape land itself into a world of wood leaves and roots. As late Devonian forests expand across floodplains and lowlands, the presence of deep-rooted plants begins to change not only the chemistry of the ground, but also the shapes of the rivers that cross it. Earlier in Earth's history, before extensive vegetation takes hold, many channels behave in a now familiar way from experimental models and young, sparsely vegetated landscapes. They split and rejoin into braided networks with bars of loose sediment that shift from season to season. Without strong cohesion in their banks, these rivers can widen easily under high flow, eroding laterally and depositing material wherever currents slacken. Channels migrate rapidly, abandon old paths and carve new ones, leaving behind a broad tangle of gravel and sand. In such environments, plants find it difficult to establish stable populations on the constantly reworked surfaces, and any thin cover that does grow is often stripped away by the next flood. As woody roots spread into these same depositional zones, the mechanics of erosion and deposition begin to change. Trees and shrubs with interlocking root systems colonize bars and banks, especially in places where floodwaters recede slowly enough to allow seeds or spores to germinate and young plants to take hold. Once established, their roots bind grains of sand, silt, and clay into a more coherent mass. Bank material becomes harder to dislodge, because it is no longer a simple aggregate of particles held together only by friction and a small amount of chemical cement. Instead, it is a composite of mineral grains and resilient organic strands. When floodwaters rise and press against these vegetated banks, the flow must expend more energy to detach and transport sediment. In many cases, the water chooses a different path, concentrating erosion at fewer points where the bank is weaker. This change favors the development of single continuous channels rather than wide multi-threaded ones. Once a main channel forms, its interaction with rooted banks leads to a characteristic pattern. On the outer side of a bend, the current runs faster and pushes against the bank, but the roots resist rapid collapse. Erosion is focused and steady rather than sudden and sweeping. On the inner side of the bend, where current is slower, sediment settles out building point bars that grow gradually over multiple seasons. Trees and other plants establish themselves on these bars as they rise their roots, quickly stabilizing the new surfaces and preventing easy remobilization. The channel responds by adjusting its course in an incremental way, eroding a little more on the outer bank and depositing a little more on the inner bank. Over long timescales, this leads to a meandering planform, a series of sinuous curves that migrate slowly across the floodplain. Geological evidence for this transition comes from sedimentary rocks that preserve the internal structures of ancient river deposits. In pre-Devonian and early Devonian strata, river sands often show patterns associated with unstable braided systems. As the Devonian progresses and plant cover increases, more deposits display features typical of meandering rivers such as crossbeds that record lateral accretion on point bars and fine-grained overbank sediments that represent repeated flooding onto relatively stable floodplain surfaces. Within these finds, paleosols develop containing root traces and organic horizons that indicate long periods of soil formation between major channel shifts. The relationship between roots and river style is not simple cause and effect in a single direction. Climate tectonics and sediment supply all influence channel behavior, and there are braided rivers in modern vegetated landscapes as well. Yet the Devonian record points to a broad correlation. Where and when deep-rooted plants are abundant, rivers are more likely to show signs of lateral stability and organized meanders. Where vegetation remains sparse, channels tend to be more unstable and multi-braided. This suggests that as plants conquer land, rivers increasingly share the task of shaping basins with terrestrial life. In late Devonian forests, the feedback between plants and water extends beyond the immediate banks. Dense vegetation on slopes and uplands slows overland flow during storms, reducing the amount of loose sediment delivered to channels. Leaf litter and woody debris cover the soil, absorbing the impact of raindrops and limiting surface erosion. As a result, rivers carry a different mixture of material than they did when slopes were bare. Suspended fine particles may still travel long distances, but there is less coarse bedload available to form unstable bars. The balance between sediment size, water discharge, and bank strength shifts in favor of narrow, deeper channels that adjust primarily through bank erosion and deposition, rather than wholesale bed reworking. The appearance of floodplains with persistent soils, rooted vegetation, and repeated flood deposits marks a new stage in landscape evolution. These surfaces are not simply transient resting places for sediment. They are dynamic environments where water, sediment, and life interact over thousands of years. Trees like Archaeopteris and other woody plants extend their roots into the upper parts of the floodplain soils, drawing on stored moisture between floods and contributing organic matter when they shed leaves, branches, and eventually whole trunks. Microbial communities and small animals process this material, turning it into humus that further modifies the physical properties of the soil. Floods arrive at intervals, depositing fresh layers of silt and clay on top of this living matrix. Each flood adds another thin archive of river behavior and plant response. Over time, the vertical stack of floodplain sediments grows thicker, and the record of plant-river interaction becomes more detailed. Within this stratified record, paleontologists and sedimentologists find evidence of log jams, root mats, and accumulations of plant debris that sometimes block channels or divert flow. These structures can cause local scour and deposition, creating new pools and bars, and can trap further sediment. In this way, fallen wood acts as both product and agent of geomorphic change. The same trees that stabilize banks when alive continue to influence river form after death, their trunks becoming large roughness elements within the flow. Modern studies of forested rivers show similar patterns, with large wood altering channel hydraulics and promoting habitat diversity. The Devonian fossils suggest that such interactions begin almost as soon as sizable woody plants appear in and around river corridors. Groundwater patterns also respond to the spread of rooted vegetation. As trees and shrubs transpire, they draw water upward from the saturated zone, lowering the water table locally and changing the gradient that drives subsurface flow. In some areas, this can create zones of enhanced infiltration near roots, as water from the surface moves downward to replace what has been drawn up. In others, it can promote lateral movement of groundwater toward channels sustaining base flow during dry periods. The net effect is to smooth extremes in river discharge, making low flows more persistent and possibly reducing the frequency of the most catastrophic floods. Though large events driven by climate and tectonics still occur, this moderated hydrology combined with stabilized banks and structured floodplains supports a more predictable set of conditions for both plants and animals living in and near rivers. With increased stability comes increased opportunity for ecological specialization. Some plants adapt to life on frequently flooded surfaces, tolerating or even requiring periodic submergence. Others prefer slightly higher positions on the floodplain, where floods are less frequent and soils remain well drained for longer periods. Early terrestrial animals, including arthropods and primitive vertebrates that venture onto land, exploit the gradient from channel to floodplain edge to upland slope, each zone offering different moisture levels, shelter, and food sources. The meandering river, with its diverse array of point bars, cut banks, oxbow lakes, and back swamps, provides a greater variety of habitats than a rapidly shifting braided system. At the same time, the very success of rooted vegetation in stabilizing rivers and soils feeds back into global cycles. As more sediment is trapped on floodplains rather than carried directly to the sea, the way in which continents deliver material to the oceans changes. Organic carbon buried in these floodplain deposits can be isolated from the atmosphere for long intervals, contributing to long-term carbon sequestration. Weathering products flushed from roots and soils enter rivers in solution and eventually reach the ocean, influencing seawater chemistry and the balance of nutrients that marine life depends on. The late Devonian world thus experiences a deepening integration between terrestrial and aquatic systems. Land plants, by modifying the structure of river networks and the character of floodplains, indirectly affect the conditions in coastal seas and beyond. This integration introduces new sensitivities. A change in forest cover in one region can alter sediment and nutrient delivery downstream, with consequences for ecosystems far from the original site of vegetation change. In modern terms, this is a coupled Earth system, but in the Devonian it is still in the process of assembling. Seen from the perspective of deep time, the spread of meandering rivers through forested landscapes resembles a kind of learning process, though it is driven by physical laws and biological evolution rather than intention. As roots deepen and wood accumulates, channels adjust their shapes to the new constraints and opportunities presented by vegetated banks and stabilized slopes. The planet's surface hydrology acquires a memory of past plant activity stored in floodplain deposits and in the very patterns of river bends. Each new generation of plants inherits a landscape already partly shaped by their predecessors, and their own growth further modifies it. In this ongoing exchange between water and wood, rivers begin to wander in ways that reflect the presence of life, as much as the pull of gravity and the push of tectonics. As forests deepen and spread during the late Devonian, the transformation they bring to the planet carries a cost that is not immediately obvious from the vantage point of the land surface. On slopes and floodplains, the presence of trees and other woody plants seems purely constructive. They stabilize soil, create habitat, and moderate local climates. Their roots build structured substrates where little existed before, and their canopies cast shade that allows new, ecological layers to develop. Yet every one of these changes is tied to chemical fluxes that reach beyond the boundaries of the forest itself, into the atmosphere and the oceans. The central currency in this exchange is carbon. Through photosynthesis, Devonian plants take in carbon dioxide from the air and water from the soil, using sunlight to assemble these molecules into organic matter. A portion of this matter forms leaves' fine roots and other tissues with relatively short lifespans. These parts are shed decomposed by microbes and fungi and return to the environment as carbon dioxide and other compounds within years or decades. Another portion, increasingly large as woody plants become more common, is locked into lignified tissues that resist simple decay. Trunks, large branches, and coarse roots incorporate carbon into structures that may persist for centuries while the plant lives, and for even longer once it dies and becomes buried. In the Devonian decay, communities are still adapting to the challenge of breaking down lignin-rich wood. As a result, a significant fraction of this woody material escapes complete decomposition, especially when it is rapidly covered by sediment on floodplains in deltas or in shallow seas. This burial of organic carbon represents a net transfer of carbon from the atmosphere to the solid earth. At the same time, deep root systems enhance the weathering of silicate minerals in rocks. When roots and associated microbes release carbon dioxide into the soil, it dissolves in pore water, forming weak acids that react with minerals in the substrate. These reactions consume carbon dioxide in a stable form, ultimately transporting it in dissolved ions to the ocean, where it can precipitate as carbonate minerals. Over millions of years, this process removes additional carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Together, organic carbon burial and silicate weathering act as sinks that gradually draw down atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. Geochemical studies of Devonian rocks, including analyses of isotopes and mineral assemblages, suggest that this drawdown is substantial between the early and late parts of the period. As carbon dioxide levels fall, the greenhouse effect weakens. The planet cools, ice accumulates at high latitudes, and in upland regions, and sea levels fluctuate. These climatic shifts interact with the changes that forests themselves impose on hydrology. Enhanced weathering boosts the delivery of dissolved nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen to rivers which carry them to the sea. On land, these nutrients feed soils and support plant growth. In the ocean, their arrival can stimulate blooms of phytoplankton and other primary producers. If nutrient input outpaces the capacity of marine ecosystems to process it, episodes of intense productivity can be followed by widespread decay, consuming oxygen in the water column. Evidence preserved in Devonian marine sediments points to periods when large parts of the ocean become oxygen poor, or even anoxic, particularly in deeper basins and along some continental margins. Dark organic rich shales accumulate under these conditions, recording intervals when normal benthic life is heavily stressed or absent. Fossil assemblages show that reef-building organisms, particularly diverse communities of corals and sponges that have dominated Devonian seas, suffer severe losses during a series of extinction pulses near the end of the period. Many species of jawless fishes and some early jawed vertebrates also decline or disappear. The timing of these crises broadly overlaps with the rise and expansion of deep-rooted forests, and with the inferred decline in atmospheric carbon dioxide, though other factors such as volcanism and shifting ocean circulation also contribute. The picture that emerges is not one of a simple chain of cause and effect, but of an interconnected system in which terrestrial vegetation becomes a major driver. As forests lock up more carbon and accelerate weathering atmospheric composition changes, as climate cools and sea level responds, shallow marine habitats expand and contract. As rivers deliver more nutrients and organic matter to coastal waters, oxygen levels in parts of the ocean fluctuate, sometimes dropping to thresholds where many organisms cannot survive. The same trees that create stable soils and complex habitats on land thus participate indirectly in destabilizing marine ecosystems. In a sense, the price of a green forested planet is paid in the currency of disrupted ocean life. For many years, researchers debate the relative importance of different mechanisms in the late Devonian mass extinction. Some emphasize climate cooling and glaciation, others the spread of anoxic waters, and others the possibility of episodic disturbances such as large volcanic events. The role of land plants sits at the intersection of these ideas. By drawing down carbon dioxide, forests contribute to cooling. By enhancing weathering, they influence both carbon sequestration and nutrient delivery. By building soils and altering river networks, they change how material moves from land to sea. Even if plants are not the sole initiators of the extinction pulses, they help set the background conditions in which those pulses unfold. One striking aspect of this episode is that it is not a single abrupt catastrophe, but a series of crises separated by partial recoveries. In between extinction phases, ecosystems reorganize. Some marine groups diversify, briefly filling niches left open by the losses of earlier events, only to be cut back again by subsequent stress. On land, the pattern is subtler, but there are signs that plant communities also experience turnover, with some lineages declining, while others, including early seed plant relatives, become more prominent in the late Devonian and early Carboniferous. The fossil record, being incomplete and unevenly distributed, cannot fully resolve the tempo and mode of these changes, yet it is clear that the path toward a fully forested world is not smooth. There are pauses, reversals, and episodes where the consequences of earlier innovations must be absorbed. The development of wood roots and complex reproductive structures enables plants to dominate land, but it also amplifies their influence to the point where their collective activity reshapes global cycles. In modern language, this is a feedback system. As vegetation expands, it changes environmental parameters that in turn affect vegetation. In the late Devonian, some of these feedbacks lead to states that are unfavorable for many marine organisms and challenging even for some terrestrial ones. Cooling climates and fluctuating sea levels alter the distribution of suitable habitats. Anoxic events in the ocean select for a narrower set of tolerant species. The result is a step change in the composition of life both in the water and on land. Yet even as forests contribute to crises, they lay the foundation for future diversity. The soils that accumulate under Devonian trees persist into later periods, enriched in organic matter and structured by root systems. These soils provide starting points for the Carboniferous expansion of swamp forests and the eventual rise of seed-bearing trees in even more varied forms. The organic rich shales deposited in anoxic seas become long-term reservoirs of stored carbon, some of which will only be returned to the atmosphere hundreds of millions of years later when humans learn to tap and burn them. The late Devonian thus stands as a turning point where the benefits and risks of a vegetated land surface become apparent on a planetary scale. One unresolved question is how inevitable such a trajectory is on worlds where plants or analogous organisms colonize land. If complex photosynthetic life gains control over large areas of continental surface, will it always tend to draw down atmospheric greenhouse gases and alter weathering rates in ways that risk destabilizing other parts of the system? Or is the Devonian combination of continents, climate, and evolving lineages a more specific set of circumstances? Another open issue concerns why particular groups suffer more than others in the associated extinctions. Reef-building organisms, for example, are especially hard hit while some other marine taxa show more resilience. Is this primarily due to their sensitivity to oxygen levels and temperature, or are there additional factors related to nutrient cycling and food web structure that are not fully captured by present evidence? From the vantage point of this ancient interval, it is clear that the greening of the continents does not simply add life to an otherwise neutral surface. It changes how the entire planet functions from mountain slopes to ocean basins. Trees and other plants confer habitability on land for a wide array of organisms, but do so in a way that forces existing ecosystems, especially in the sea, to confront new physical and chemical realities. The price of a green planet is not measured only in the diversity of forests that arise, but also in the losses that accompany their rise. Even so, the late Devonian world, with its mix of newly formed forests, changing rivers, and stressed but still active seas, is not an endpoint. It is one phase in a longer sequence of adjustments between life and environment, a sequence in which plants continue to act as both creators of opportunity and agents of constraint. By the end of the Devonian period, the main structural and physiological features that characterize modern land plants are largely in place. Roots penetrate deeply into soils, wood built from secondary xylem supports. Stems and trunks branching systems distribute leaves through space, and many lineages have adopted reproductive strategies that move beyond simple equal-sized spores. The continents that once carried only thin films of vegetation now host forests, thickets, and low plant cover extending far from shorelines. Rivers meander through floodplains stabilized by roots, and soils enriched with organic matter form a continuous interface between rock and air. Yet one conspicuous feature of many present-day ecosystems is still missing. Flowers, with their specialized structures for attracting pollinators and protecting developing seeds, have not yet evolved. The world is green wood, filled and structurally complex, but it is not yet the flowering world of later eras. In this interval after the Devonian but before the rise of flowering plants, further refinements build on the foundations laid by the first trees and forests. Seed plants emerge and diversify, adding a new level of resilience to plant life on land. A seed encloses the embryo stored food and protective layers in a single compact unit. It allows the next generation to endure periods of cold drought or other adverse conditions, sometimes for years, before germinating when circumstances improve. The origin of seeds can be traced back to the heterosporous systems seen in late Devonian plants, where distinct male and female spores differ in size and resource content. Over time, tissues around the female spore become more elaborate, enclosing and nourishing it, while mechanisms for receiving and guiding male contributions become more specialized. By the early Carboniferous forests in some regions are dominated by seed-bearing plants, including early relatives of conifers and other gymnosperms. These forests occupy lowlands, uplands, and swampy basins, extending the Devonian trend toward extensive land plant cover. In coal-forming wetlands, dense stands of trees and large herbaceous plants contribute vast amounts of organic material that accumulate in waterlogged conditions where decay is slow. This material compresses and transforms over geological time into thick coal seams, another long-term store of carbon captured by photosynthesis and removed from the active atmosphere ocean system. The presence of seeds allows plants to colonize more varied environments, including areas with stronger seasonality, greater temperature extremes, or more irregular rainfall than those tolerated by many spore-dependent lineages. Seeds can remain dormant through unfavorable seasons and germinate rapidly when moisture and warmth return. They can also be transported by wind water and eventually animals over greater distances than many spores, particularly when combined with structures that aid dispersal. The spread of seeded vegetation thus continues the process begun in the Devonian of decoupling plant life cycles from the most immediate constraints of surface water availability. At the same time, the basic architecture of land plant bodies remains recognizable. Roots explore the ground, stems and trunks carry tissues upward, leaves intercept light, and vascular networks connect all parts. The appearance of flowers much later in the Mesozoic does not replace these elements, but overlays them with further complexity, integrating reproduction more tightly with animal behavior and environmental cues. Between the Devonian and the first flowering forests, terrestrial life moves through multiple phases of adjustment and elaboration, yet it does so using a toolkit that is already well established. From a planetary perspective, the key question becomes how far the influence of plants on Earth systems can extend. The late Devonian shows that forests can drive significant changes in carbon cycling, climate, and ocean chemistry. The Carboniferous and later periods demonstrate that this influence can continue and even intensify as vegetation spreads and diversifies. Large coal deposits accumulate oxygen levels in the atmosphere rise, and new habitats appear for animals on land. Each of these developments amplifies the role of plants as engineers of the global environment. Yet the sequence of events that leads from low Ordovician mats to Devonian forests and then to seed-dominated and later flowering worlds is not necessarily the only path by which a planet might be transformed. On another world, with continents, water, and a star that delivers energy at the right rate, life might invent different molecular structures instead of lignin to stiffen its tissues. It might rely on different solutions for moving internal fluids or use alternative strategies for reproduction and dispersal. Even so, certain constraints would still apply. Any organism that attempts to live on land must cope with gravity drying and the intermittent nature of surface water. It must find ways to anchor itself, to move resources from one part of its body to another, and to project its lineage forward in time through vulnerable early stages. On Earth, the conquest of land by plants solves these problems through the evolution of roots, wood vascular tissues, spores, and seeds. On other planets, the solutions might look different in detail, but would likely serve similar functions. This parallel invites a broader reflection on the Devonian story. The fossil forests of Gilboa and other sites capture particular experiments in plant form, some of which lead to lasting lineages, while others end in extinction. The small early woody plants whose stems barely rise above the ground show that wood can appear in modest context before supporting tall trees. The complex root systems that bind Devonian floodplains demonstrate that significant environmental effects can arise from structures hidden below the surface. The spore-based yet tree-sized Archaeopteris reveals that large dominant plants do not require fully developed seeds to reshape landscapes and climates. Each step in this history is contingent on specific conditions, yet the overall direction is toward greater integration between living structures and the physical environment. By the time flowers evolve perhaps 100 million years or more after the first forest's land plants are deeply embedded in global cycles. Insects and other animals interact with them in dense networks of pollination, herbivory, and mutualism. Soils are thick, layered, and saturated with organic matter. Rivers and coastlines bear unmistakable signatures of biological influence. The planet seen from above would appear green-patched and patterned by vegetation across much of its continental surface. All of this rests on the initial slower changes of the Ordovician and Devonian, when plants first solved the basic problems of standing upright, transporting water, and reproducing away from constant immersion. Despite the apparent completeness of this sequence, important questions remain open. It is not yet fully clear how many times wood-complex roots and seed-like reproductive systems evolve independently, nor how many of these experiments fail before one or two lineages become dominant. The fossil record preserves only a fraction of the organisms that once lived, and it is biased towards certain environments and materials. There may have been entire groups of Devonian plants that left little trace because their tissues decayed easily, or because they occupied regions where sedimentary records are sparse. Likewise, the exact timing and sequence of plant-induced changes in climate and ocean chemistry are still being refined as new data and models become available. The link between forest expansion, carbon dioxide decline, and marine extinctions is supported by multiple lines of evidence, but the contributions of volcanism, continental configuration, and ocean circulation patterns are still being quantified. These uncertainties do not erase the central conclusion that plants have become major agents in shaping Earth's history by the end of the Devonian. Rather, they highlight how much remains to be understood about the precise pathways and feedbacks involved. Standing at this point in the narrative just before flowering plants appear, the planet has already undergone one of the most dramatic transitions in its history. A surface once dominated by bare rock, thin microbial films and water has become a world of structured soils, meandering rivers and forests that alter the air itself. The conquest of land by plants has changed the conditions for all subsequent evolution, opening opportunities for terrestrial animals influencing the chemistry of the oceans and setting long-term trends in climate. Yet the story is not finished. The arrival of flowers, the spread of grasses, and the many later changes in the biosphere will unfold against a backdrop prepared by Devonian trees and their successors. The question that lingers is how far this kind of transformation can go, and how stable a planet remains once life begins to rearrange its basic cycles. On Earth, the answers are still being written in rock layers and living communities. On other worlds, if they exist, similar stories may be starting or already underway with their own versions of roots, wood, and forests reaching into alien skies.